I didn't argue when my son said everything would be his. He didn't even look at me, just smiled with that same condescending expression I'd known since he was a boy. His mother's will, he said, was just a formality. He had already decided I was forgotten, erased, unworthy. But one line in the lawyer's voice turned the room upside down, not because everything changed, but because someone remembered who, in this family, had once built not just the houses, but the very foundation of what they called their life. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Gregory Hansen. I was 72 years old when this all began. For most of my adult life, I was a structural engineer. Not the kind who spent their days clicking buttons in an air-conditioned tower, but the kind who carried a thermos in the field and sketched reinforcement lines in the margins of coffee-stained blueprints. I specialized in bridges, steel, concrete, sometimes timber. I liked the concept of connecting two places that otherwise couldn't meet. It made sense to me. It gave shape to life. I lived in Spokane, Washington, in a one-story house that hadn't been painted since my knees could handle ladders. The roof sagged in the corners, the porch boards groaned like old men themselves, and the furnace had a whistle that could rival a train. I didn't mind. I had heat, a bed, a kettle that still whistled, and a chair that knew the shape of my back. I didn't need much more. I had no pets. I had no living parents. I had one son, Marcus, and an ex-wife named Elaine. The house was quiet most days. The kind of quiet that didn't just settle over the rooms. It lived there. It moved with the light and pressed in during the long afternoons. I used to find it unbearable. Then I stopped noticing. The mornings were always the same. I woke up early, usually before the sky shifted from black to ash. I boiled water, made instant coffee, sometimes cooked eggs if the fridge allowed. I read the newspaper, printed, not digital, and solved the crossword with a dull pencil I never sharpened. On Mondays, I took out the trash. On Thursdays, I walked to the post office, even if I didn't expect any mail. I liked the routine. It gave my days edges. I wasn't always like this. There was a time I was the man people called when deadlines loomed and steel bent where it shouldn't. I once helped prevent a partial collapse on an overpass near Sacramento by crawling under it with a flashlight and a notepad. That was in 1994. I was 41 then, leaner, louder, and still wearing a wedding band. I lost the band in a hotel sink in Denver. The marriage followed a year later. Elaine said I was married to my job. I guess she was right. I didn't argue much. I never raised my voice. That was always her complaint. She said silence could be crueler than shouting. I didn't believe that at the time. Now I'm not so sure. Marcus stayed with her after the divorce. He was 17 and already taking after his mother. Sharp-tongued, impatient, brilliant in a ruthless sort of way. I sent cards at first. Birthdays, graduations, small notes about the weather, or a bridge I'd passed that reminded me of something we once saw on vacation. He never replied. Eventually, the cards came back unopened. Then I stopped sending them. Still, I thought about him. Every time I crossed a bridge, I imagined explaining to him why it stood the way it did. Every time I read about new infrastructure bills or saw news about California's drought-resistant cement mixes, I wondered if he'd gone into engineering, like he once said he might. But I didn't know, and no one told me. I didn't have many visitors. Sometimes a neighbor waved. Once a month, a woman from the city came to inspect the back fence because I lived near a runoff channel. She never stayed long. The silence became my companion. It didn't demand anything. It didn't leave. That winter, Spokane had more snow than usual, the kind of snow that piled like memory, soft, white, and heavy. I spent most days inside, listening to the heater rattle and sipping weak coffee. I reread old journals, ones I'd kept during jobs in the Dakotas and Michigan. I thought about mailing a letter to Marcus, but I had nothing to say that hadn't already been ignored. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March, something changed. I was sitting by the window, watching two crows fight over a piece of plastic in the yard. The wind was high, and the sky looked bruised. I heard the rattle of the mailbox lid. I didn't move right away. Mail came so rarely, it didn't feel urgent. But when I did step outside and open the box, I saw an envelope that didn't belong among the usual coupon flyers and bank statements. It was thick, heavy, cream-colored, with my full name typed in neat black letters across the front. Gregory Hansen, not resident, not to whom it may concern. My name. The return address was a law firm in Los Angeles, Drake & Partners. I held the envelope in my hand for a long time before opening it. There was weight in the paper that had nothing to do with thickness. Inside, the letter was brief. I was invited, formally, to the reading of the last will and testament of Elaine Gardner, formerly Elaine Hansen. The date was in 2 weeks. The location was in Bel Air, California. The name Marcus Hansen appeared in the CC line, though I wasn't sure if he knew I was invited. My hands were cold when I folded the letter back into its envelope. I didn't sit down. I just stood there, staring at the yard, at the snow melting into muddy grass. Elaine was gone. I didn't cry. I didn't feel what I thought I should. Just a slow, settling realization that the only person who once truly knew me, loved me, fought with me, built a life with me, no longer walked the earth. Whatever we had, however broken, was now sealed in something colder than silence. And now, someone wanted me in a room again with her name on the wall. I wasn't sure why, but I knew I would go. I had spent too much of my life building things for other people. Bridges, homes, stability. Now, maybe, it was time to see what had been left for me, not in dollars or deeds, but in decisions made without my knowledge. I folded the envelope again, laid it on the kitchen table, and made a fresh cup of coffee. The heater clanged in the walls. Outside, the crows had flown away. The morning after I received the letter, the wind picked up. It howled through the gaps in my window frames and knocked brittle branches against the siding. I sat at the table, the letter still resting beneath the salt shaker, as if pinning it down might delay what it represented. I hadn't touched it since opening it, but I kept glancing at it as though it might start speaking. It already had, in its own way. It had whispered something that felt like the beginning of an ending. I spent the day not deciding. I brewed coffee and poured it out. I made toast and forgot it in the toaster until it burned. I tried to read but couldn't absorb the words. They floated on the page like pollen, light, meaningless, constantly slipping away. Outside, snow started to fall again. Big, heavy flakes like those you only see in the deepest part of winter. The kind that muffles all noise, that buries everything under a white silence so thick it feels deliberate. I watched it for hours. There was something comforting in its stillness. It made no demands, offered no opinions. It simply was. In the late afternoon, I went to the shed behind the house. I hadn't opened it in months. The door stuck from the cold, and I had to shoulder it open. Inside, I found an old suitcase, navy blue, scuffed at the corners, the handle wrapped in duct tape. I didn't know yet if I'd pack it, but I brought it inside anyway. It sat by the front door like a question I wasn't ready to answer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my chair with a blanket over my knees, listening to the house creak. The wind had picked up even more. It screamed at the roof like it was angry at the idea of shelter. The power flickered once, then held. I watched the clock change by the minute. At 2:13 a.m., I finally got up and walked barefoot to the front porch. The snow had stopped, but the world was unrecognizable. Everything was blanketed in white. The street, the trees, the fence, gone. All of it covered like an erased blackboard, as if nothing had ever happened there, as if no one had ever walked those sidewalks or driven down that road. It felt like the world had wiped itself clean. It felt like maybe I was the only thing left that remembered. And then I said her name out loud. Elaine. Just the one word. Not loud. Not bitter. I didn't even realize I'd said it until the sound echoed back from the trees. I hadn't spoken her name in years. Not since the divorce. Not since the cards stopped coming. Not since the photographs had been packed away and the wedding ring had been swallowed by a drain in Denver. She had been the first person who ever made me feel both known and invisible. She saw through me in a way that both thrilled and terrified me. Her presence had always carried weight, like a sharp wind before a storm. And now she was gone, and the wind had nothing left to circle around. Back inside, I opened the cupboard where I kept my old albums. I hadn't looked at them in ages. The covers were dusty, the pages stiff from disuse. The first one had our wedding on the cover. It was July 1973, and she was smiling in a way I'd forgotten. We were both so young. Her dress wasn't expensive, but she made it look like it belonged in a magazine. My suit didn't quite fit, but she'd said I looked serious and soft, which had made me laugh at the time. There were pictures of our first apartment, the one above the deli on 7th. She'd hated the smell of onions coming through the floorboards, but loved the view of the city. There were photos of Marcus as a baby, his eyes wide and always staring at the camera, as if already skeptical of the world. I flipped through the pages until the images began to blur, not from emotion, but from time. The ink had faded, the corners had curled, even memories age, even paper forgets. Later that morning, I checked the obituary section online. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I wanted proof. Maybe I needed to see her name in print to believe that she really was gone. It didn't take long to find. Her name was listed 3rd in the Los Angeles Times, in a crisp serif font. Elaine Gardner, 71, philanthropist, entrepreneur, and advocate for women in business, passed away peacefully in her home on March 9th. The words barely scratched the surface. They listed her board memberships, her donations, her awards. They mentioned the university wing named after her. They noted her survived by her son, Marcus Gardner. There was no mention of me, not even as a former spouse. I had been edited out, like an early draft that no longer suited the final story. That's when it hit me. Not grief, not even bitterness, but a hollowing. It wasn't that she had died. It was that she had died in a world that no longer remembered I'd once been part of hers. Our marriage had been real. Our fights, our plans, our shared bed, our child. All of it had happened. And yet now, I was a ghost even in the recounting of her life. The snow outside had started to melt, but not quickly. The streets were still covered. The plows hadn't come. The world was on pause. It gave me space to breathe, space to consider what it meant to be invited to a reading of a will I hadn't known existed. Why me? Why now? I thought about calling someone, anyone, but there was no one to call. No one who knew both of us. No one who would remember the July heat of our wedding or the rainstorm in Oregon when we'd argued for hours about nothing and everything. That afternoon, I sat back down at the table. I read the letter again. This time, I let each word sink in. I was being asked to step back into a story I thought had ended, not just as a footnote, but as someone named directly. My presence was required. It wasn't just legal. It was intentional. Whatever Elaine had done, she'd made sure I was part of the ending. I didn't yet know why. I didn't know if it would hurt or help, but I knew I would go. Not for money, not for revenge, for memory, for weight, for the part of my life that had been swallowed by time and silence. I closed the album, packed the suitcase by the door, and booked a ticket to Los Angeles. The flight from Spokane to Los Angeles felt longer than it was. Not in time, but in distance, measured by memory. I watched clouds drift past the window as if they were rolling back the years, peeling away layers I'd deliberately let settle. I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't eat. I kept the envelope with the lawyer's letter in my coat pocket, folded twice over, even though I'd memorized every word. When I landed, the air hit me like an open oven, dry and warm, carrying the scent of asphalt and oleander. The sky was too bright, too big. I wasn't used to it anymore. I hailed a cab, gave the driver the address written at the bottom of the letter, and sat back while the city unfolded itself through the windows. I recognized none of it. Los Angeles had changed. Buildings stretched higher, streets buzzed with quiet aggression, and everything moved like it had somewhere better to be. The driver didn't talk, and I didn't mind. I kept looking out at a city where I had once known the corners and shadows. Now, it all felt like a stage set rebuilt by strangers. When the car turned onto a narrow, shaded drive, my hands tightened on my knees. I recognized the stone wall first, cream-colored, lined with climbing vines that someone had clearly hired a gardener to tame. Then came the wrought iron gate, now motorized, rising silently as we approached. Beyond it, the house came into view. The house Elaine and I had once dreamed about building. Not this version exactly, but the idea of it. High on a hill, overlooking the city, where the lights would glitter like spilled diamonds after dark. Back then, we had talked about gardens, open windows, a wide porch where we could drink coffee and watch our son play. What stood before me now was colder, grander, surgically perfect. White stucco, black-trimmed windows, slate roof, and towering palms flanking the entrance like guards. It looked like something in a magazine, or a mausoleum. I paid the driver and stepped out, suitcase in hand. A young man in a dark suit stood by the door, holding a clipboard. He didn't smile. He asked my name, nodded when I gave it, and motioned me inside without a word. The hallway swallowed me. The interior was hushed, climate-controlled, almost sacred. Marble floors, high ceilings, art I didn't recognize. Not a trace of the woman I once knew. Not a single photo in sight. Everything was curated to the point of sterility. I followed the man down a corridor, past rooms that seemed designed to impress, not to live in. A sitting room opened ahead, large and formal, with velvet chairs and a fireplace trimmed in brass. That's where I saw him. Marcus, my son. He stood near the window, back turned to me, looking out at the city. He was taller than I remembered, broader in the shoulders, dressed in a suit that cost more than my entire monthly pension. His posture radiated ownership, as if this was not just his home, but his kingdom. He didn't turn around. I didn't announce myself. There were others in the room. A man in a gray suit, probably the lawyer. A woman in pearls. Two people I didn't know, whispering near a drinks table. No one looked my way. I wasn't late, but I was already unnecessary. I chose a chair by the wall, near a tall plant that reached toward the ceiling like it was trying to escape. The leather squeaked as I sat, the only sound I made. I didn't take off my coat. I didn't put down the suitcase. I simply waited. The room was full of the quiet hum of power, people who knew where the money was and who controlled it. I recognized the expressions, detached, confident, always scanning. They reminded me of the architects I used to work with, men who walked around a site with clean hands and spoke only in measurements and cost projections. Elaine had lived here, slept in these rooms, hosted parties I would never be invited to, and now she was gone, and the house had no trace of her breath. The walls did not remember me. They did not remember us. They were new walls, painted over too many times. I stared at the fireplace. The mantel was bare. No photographs, no flowers, no tokens of a life lived. Just a long piece of dark wood, perfectly polished. It could have been in a hotel. For a brief moment, I wondered if this entire visit had been a mistake. Maybe I had come for closure, but there was nothing to close. Just a room full of people who no longer saw me, and a house that had erased me with architectural precision. Marcus finally turned. He looked past me. Not through me. Past me. His eyes slid over my face like I was furniture. I saw a flicker, almost recognition, but it vanished so quickly I couldn't catch it. He walked to the other side of the room, greeted the lawyer, shook hands with someone I didn't know. He didn't speak to me. He didn't nod. He didn't flinch. I felt something shift in my chest. Not pain exactly. Not even disappointment. Something quieter. Acknowledgement. This was no longer a bridge to repair. It was a finished project, walked away from, catalogued, forgotten. The lawyer cleared his throat. He held a folder in his hands, thick with paper and importance. The room stilled. I sat straighter, but not for them. I wasn't here to beg. I wasn't here to argue. I had built bridges over rivers too wide for most men to imagine crossing. And now I sat in a room where memory had no walls left to cling to, in a house that had let go of its ghosts. I listened for her, not for her voice, not even her name, but for the echo of her presence. There was none. Only the sound of the lawyer flipping to the first page. The lawyer's voice broke through the hush of the room like a gavel. Precise, rehearsed, free of emotion. He spoke as though none of us were people, only names on a ledger, numbers in a spreadsheet, legal clauses waiting to be executed. His tone had the cadence of someone who'd done this too many times to care about sentiment. Perhaps that was his strength, or maybe it was just survival. He began with formalities, Elaine's full legal name, the date of death, the registry, and then a preamble about the nature of the document we were about to hear. The will of Elaine Gardner, a woman whose life could no longer respond, only echo. The words hung in the stillness like dust in sunlight. I noticed how each person in the room held themselves, rigid, composed, but hungry. They weren't mourning. They were listening for their names. I watched Marcus closely. He sat now, one leg crossed over the other, his hand wrapped casually around a crystal tumbler of something amber. His fingers tapped against the glass with slow rhythm. He was smiling, not broadly, but with a calm, anticipatory confidence. It wasn't arrogance, exactly. It was the certainty of someone who had been assured, explicitly or implicitly, that this moment would serve him. That his reward was not a question, but a scheduled transaction. He looked like a man listening to a victory being read aloud. The lawyer began with the usual. Charitable donations, a trust to a university, a scholarship in Elaine's name for young women in finance. Each item was delivered with the weight of intention, but it wasn't until the assets began to emerge that the temperature in the room shifted. Properties, 4 in total. 1 in Aspen, 1 in Maui, 1 in Manhattan, and the primary residence we were sitting in now. Vehicles, artwork, bonds, company shares. It was a parade of luxury and value, enough to fill lives many times over. With each list item, I noticed the subtle movements of approval. A nod from the man in the gray suit. A satisfied inhale from the woman in pearls. A glance exchanged between 2 of the unknown guests. But Marcus didn't move. His smile only deepened. It was the way someone smiled when hearing what they already knew, or thought they knew. There was something else in that smile, too. I recognized it. I'd seen it on his mother's face once, years ago, when she'd finalized the sale of a property we'd built together. She hadn't even told me she was selling it. Just waited until it was done, then handed me the paperwork to sign. There had been the same quiet pride, not just in the deal, but in the performance of control. I hadn't argued. I'd signed, and I'd remembered. Marcus leaned forward now, his eyes half-lidded with satisfaction. The lawyer turned a page. His voice dipped slightly in tone, the first real shift in tempo. I hereby leave to my son, Marcus Gardner. The sentence floated, unfinished, as though the lawyer wanted the weight of the name to settle first. Marcus didn't blink. He was still smiling. The following: full residential and administrative rights to the estate located at... Another list followed. The language was dense, legal, formal. It outlined rights, transfers, but also conditions. Trustees, oversight. Certain properties would be held in corporate shells, others in charitable arms. It wasn't as direct as Marcus had hoped. His fingers stopped tapping the glass. I saw a tiny wrinkle form between his brows. The lawyer continued. More conditions, more complexity. I sat still, hands on my knees. I didn't react. I didn't lean forward. I didn't shift. I listened. Then something strange happened. The lawyer mentioned the foundation. The Gardner Future Bridges Fund, he said, established in 2008. It wasn't just a name. It was a memory. That had been my idea, back when Elaine still took my calls. A foundation that supported infrastructure education, scholarships, and community bridge repairs across rural America. It was one of the few things we had once agreed on. I had even written the first draft of the proposal, long before it became real. Of course, by the time it launched, my name had been quietly erased. I thought it had withered, that it had been absorbed into Elaine's growing empire and repurposed for image and tax strategy. I had no idea it still existed, let alone flourished. Marcus shifted in his chair. The lawyer glanced at a separate document, then returned to the main one. And with regard to the Gardner Future Bridges Fund, he continued, all administrative power, financial oversight, and final decision-making authority is hereby granted to Gregory Hansen. The room broke, not with sound, not with chaos, with silence. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, thick with breath that never escaped. Even the air in the vents seemed to pause. I didn't move. Marcus didn't blink. The lawyer looked up for the first time and met my eyes. There was no mistake. It had been spoken. I heard someone exhale sharply, as though trying to disguise a laugh or a cough. The woman in pearls lowered her glass. Marcus finally moved, just his head, turning slowly toward me. His face had shifted from smugness to confusion to disbelief. His mouth was open slightly, his jaw tight, but no words came out. The lawyer resumed, unbothered. The foundation was the holding mechanism I now understood. It was the spine beneath the muscles of Elaine's estate. It controlled assets indirectly, gave guidance to distributions, influenced charities, influenced people. And now, all of it, every piece connected to it, passed through me. My name had been invisible for so long, even I had stopped expecting it to appear. But Elaine had remembered. She had done it deliberately, whether to spite Marcus or to honor something we once shared, I didn't know. But she had written me into the center of her empire's skeleton. Marcus looked at me again, not with fury, not yet. It was the look of a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was not made of marble, but ice. And something had cracked. I didn't return his stare. I looked at the folder in the lawyer's hands. The words had already been spoken. The line had already been drawn. And the laugh I had heard from Marcus, careless, full of assurance, still lingered in my memory, echoing behind the silence that now wrapped the room like a second skin. The room didn't recover, not right away. After the sentence was read, it hung there in the stale, expensive air like the last echo of something explosive. No one spoke. No one shifted in their seat. The lawyer's voice continued, but it was background noise now, drowned out by the weight of that one sentence. The line that changed the shape of the room, the line that turned a confident heir into a stunned observer, the line that slid my name across a table where I had not been welcome in decades. I sat without moving. My hands rested loosely in my lap. though every tendon in them was alive with something I couldn't name. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was a slow, quiet rising of awareness, a pressure behind the ribs, like the very structure of my body was remembering what it meant to matter. I kept my eyes forward, but I could feel his gaze. Marcus, my son. The man who had once crawled into my lap after nightmares, who had once asked me to explain why bridges curved when the earth did not. Now he stared at me like I was a stranger who had picked a lock to his inheritance. I didn't look at him. The lawyer read on, his voice a steady metronome, naming secondary assets and formalities. But the rhythm had been broken. What came after the line didn't matter. Not really. The room had been cleaved. Before the line, Marcus was the center. After it, he was orbiting something he didn't expect. I sat in my chair, still near the plant in the corner, and tried to understand what Elaine had done. Not just in logistics, but in spirit. She had drawn a line, not a cruel one, not an angry one, a deliberate one. A quiet shift in the balance of everything this room believed to be true. It wasn't money, not exactly. It was authority, power of decision, the kind of power that moves beneath the surface of legal documents and boardroom votes, the kind of power that says yes or no and cannot be overturned by blood or assumption. She had placed that in my hands. I wondered how long ago she had written those words. Was it recent? A year ago? Longer? Had she done it in a moment of bitterness or clarity? Had she sat at this same table picturing Marcus's reaction? Had she smiled when she signed? Or had she done it quietly, maybe even regretfully, knowing the cost? The lawyer reached the end of the document. He closed the folder and set it on the table. He said something about copies and contact and next steps, but the room didn't move. No one stood. No one clapped the way people do when a decision goes their way. Even the air seemed hesitant. Marcus finally stood. It was a slow movement, deliberate. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his cuffs. His face had gone pale, not the kind of pale that comes from illness, the kind that comes from the sudden collapse of certainty. He didn't look at me directly, just beyond me, through me. Then he left the room. No words, no confrontation, just footsteps across marble, then silence again. The other guests began to rise, trickling out in pairs or alone. Some offered brief nods to the lawyer, others avoided eye contact altogether. No one spoke to me. I didn't expect them to. I was still, to most of them, an old man with no position. Until now. When the room was nearly empty, I finally stood. My knees ached from sitting too long. The suitcase I had carried in sat by the wall like it had been waiting patiently for its next instruction. I walked toward the mantel. The fireplace beneath it hadn't been lit. The wood was decorative, the hearth clean, unused. I ran my fingers along the edge of the mantel, feeling the grain. Beneath the polish, it was still real wood. Still something that had once been whole before it was cut and shaped into something beautiful and ignored. I wondered how long this room would remember what had happened inside it. How long before Marcus rewrote the story in his mind. How long before the others forgot the exact phrasing. But I would remember. I would remember the stillness that followed that line. I would remember the way my name had been spoken with formality and weight, not as an afterthought, but as a decision. That sentence hadn't just given me authority. It had given me presence. It had pulled me out of the shadows of my own life and placed me in the center of something larger than memory. I turned toward the windows. The view stretched wide, the city below glowing in the early evening, lights beginning to flicker on, traffic inching its way through the veins of Los Angeles. A city I had once loved, then left. A city that had changed without me. I wondered if I had changed too, or if I had simply returned to a shape I used to hold. I picked up the suitcase and walked out of the room. The lawyer didn't stop me. No one did. In the hallway, the lights were softer. The walls were lined with art I still didn't recognize. But the silence was mine now. It followed me like an old coat, familiar, worn, but not heavy. I stepped outside, into the fading light. The air was warmer than I remembered, and the weight of that one sentence still sat gently, but firmly, across my shoulders. I didn't stay in the house that night. I didn't ask if I could, and no one offered. I walked down the long driveway in the dark, pulling my suitcase behind me like it was a question that hadn't yet been answered. The security lights tracked my movement, casting long shadows that bent and shifted across the walls of the estate. When I reached the gate, it opened without ceremony, and I passed through it without looking back. I found a motel 10 blocks away. Nothing luxurious, just a clean bed, a working lock, and a small window with a view of a parking lot. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't unpack. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sound of passing cars until I fell asleep sitting up. In the morning, I walked to a diner I remembered from years ago. It had a different name now, new signage, but the bones were the same. I ordered black coffee and dry toast. The waitress didn't ask questions. That silence was a kind of gift. The lawyer called before noon. He asked if I had any questions. I said no. He asked if I would like to schedule a formal briefing. I said I would think about it. He was polite, careful, but there was something else in his tone. Deference. Not because of who I was, but because of what I now held. That shift was not lost on either of us. After the call, I sat outside on a metal bench and watched people pass. Young couples, joggers, people on phones. Everyone moved with purpose, with noise. I felt like an island in their current. Later that afternoon, I received another call. This one from a number I didn't recognize. I answered it, not expecting what came next. It was Marcus. His voice was clipped, distant, but not angry. Not yet. He said he wanted to meet, to talk through next steps, as he put it. I said yes, but only if we met in public. He agreed. We chose a cafe downtown, somewhere neutral. When I arrived, he was already there, seated at a corner table wearing sunglasses and scrolling through his phone. He looked up only when I reached the chair across from him. He didn't smile. I didn't either. He launched straight into it. He spoke about logistics, about expectations, about the potential implications of the clause. He used words like collaborate, strategic, and transparent. He spoke quickly, precisely, the way people do when they're used to getting what they want. But underneath the polish, I could hear it, the slight tremble, the carefully buried panic. He talked about the foundation. He called it the core. He asked if I had considered letting him continue handling it operationally. He framed it as efficiency, continuity. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't nod or shake my head. I sat there with my hands folded and watched his face shift each time he realized I wasn't reacting the way he expected. No outrage, no argument, just stillness. When he paused for breath, I finally spoke. I told him I had no intention of causing harm. I told him I wanted to understand the structure before making decisions. I told him I would take my time. He didn't like that. He didn't raise his voice, but his jaw tensed. His fingers curled slightly on the table. He reminded me that public perception mattered, that donors might grow uncomfortable with uncertainty, that the media like to invent narratives. I said nothing. He leaned back and exhaled hard, as if trying to summon composure. Then he asked, flatly, almost casually, if I would consider stepping aside, quietly, with dignity. He said it would be cleaner. I looked at him and waited. I didn't flinch. He kept talking. He made an offer, undisclosed sum, legal documents, confidentiality agreements. He framed it as a win-win. I let him finish. Then I said one sentence. Only one. I told him I would think about it. That was all. My voice never rose. I saw it land, not like a punch, but like a stone in water. Small, deliberate, with ripples that didn't stop. He stared at me for a long time. Then he nodded, as if conceding something he didn't understand. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and left without shaking my hand. I remained at the table after he was gone. I finished my coffee. I watched the street outside shift and shimmer in the California sun. The world had changed for him in that room during the will reading, but the real change was happening now. In the silence he couldn't penetrate. In the space he couldn't control. Because I had spoken without volume. Because I hadn't begged, or negotiated, or threatened. Because the loudest thing in that meeting had been the quiet. And I knew then that I would not step aside. I would not vanish to make space for the narrative he preferred. Not out of spite. Not out of vengeance. But because I had been silent for too long. And now, when I finally spoke, it would be on my terms, in a voice that never needed to rise to be heard. I returned to the house 2 days later, not because I was asked, not because anything demanded it. I came back because I needed to see it again when it was empty. I needed to walk through its silence and measure the weight of absence. There are some truths that only become clear when the noise is gone and the chairs are left slightly askew, when the echo is the only thing that still knows your name. It was late in the morning when I arrived. The gate opened again without resistance, but this time I walked through it instead of being driven. The long drive curved up like a question I had no intention of answering. A gardener was trimming the hedge near the west side. He looked up briefly, didn't speak, then returned to his work. I liked that. The invisibility. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside and was greeted by the stillness that follows performance. The air was cool and too clean, filtered and conditioned like the breath of a machine. I stood in the foyer for a full minute, just listening. The house had the kind of silence that you don't find in lived-in homes. It wasn't the silence of rest. It was the silence of waiting, of surfaces never touched, of couches never truly sat on, of corners dusted by people who had never stopped there. I walked toward the sitting room where the will had been read. The door was half open. The sunlight streamed in at an angle that cut through the air like a blade, highlighting the dust in perfect, motionless particles. That room had changed, not in appearance, but in meaning. I stepped inside. The chairs were still arranged in a semicircle. The folders were gone. The crystal tumblers were gone. The people were gone. But their outlines remained, not physically, but in the way the room held the memory of posture. A bend here, a turned head there. The tension still lived in the carpet. I sat in the same chair I had chosen before, by the tall potted plant in the corner. Its leaves were glossy and unnaturally green, probably artificial. I leaned back and let the room wrap itself around me. I thought about Elaine. I wondered how often she had sat in this room, whether she'd ever sat in this chair, whether she had stared out of the same window and watched the sky change over the city, whether she'd ever walked through this house barefoot, or if she'd floated above it all in shoes meant more for statement than for touch. I stood again and moved to the fireplace. The mantel was still empty. I ran my fingers across the wood. It had been polished recently. There wasn't a trace of dust, but no fingerprints either. It was a place made to be looked at, not lived with. On the far wall was a painting I hadn't noticed before. Large, abstract, a storm of gray and gold. The kind of thing people buy to impress the idea of themselves into the space, rather than reflect who they really are. Elaine had once loved Impressionism. She used to say that Monet painted with breath, not brushes. I didn't see any breath in this piece, just arrangement. I left the sitting room and walked down the hall. I didn't open every door. I didn't need to. I wasn't searching. I was tracing. Each step was less about discovery and more about acknowledgement. This had been her world. She had built it, curated it, paid for it, defended it. She had let it speak for her when her voice no longer wished to. In the kitchen, I found a faint echo of her. A ceramic bowl on the counter, chipped at the rim. Blue and white, floral pattern. That was hers. I remembered it. We bought it at a flea market in Santa Fe, back when we still drove without destinations. She had bargained the price down with a smile, then told me it was the most elegant thing she'd ever owned. I never understood how she could shift so effortlessly from charm to steel. That bowl had survived every move, and now it sat alone in a kitchen with granite counters and glass front cabinets, out of place in its own home. I touched it gently, then left it where it was. Further down the hall, I passed a room with the door slightly ajar. It was a study. Bookshelves lined the walls, though most of the books were pristine. I ran my hand across a row of hardcovers. Their spines had no creases. Their pages had never been touched. They were decorative, ideas boxed and shelved. There was a desk by the window, sleek, black, with a computer monitor the size of a small television. I sat in the chair, leather and cold. On the desk, a single notepad, blank. A pen, uncapped. A glass paperweight shaped like a sphere, filled with tiny suspended gold flakes. It looked heavy, but meaningless. I opened the desk drawer. Inside, perfectly arranged pens, envelopes, paper clips. In the back corner, a small wooden box. I lifted it out and opened it. Photographs. Not many. I flipped through them slowly. A younger Elaine, with her mother. A photo of Marcus as a boy, standing beside a birthday cake with one candle. A black and white shot of a bridge under construction. Mine. I recognized the trusses. I recognized the pencil sketch in the corner. It had been my first major contract. I hadn't known she kept this. And then, a photo of the two of us. Early years. A picnic somewhere. I was in jeans. She in a white blouse. We weren't smiling at the camera. We were looking at each other. I held the picture longer than I meant to. I put it back in the box and closed the drawer. The room felt smaller now, not because anything had changed, but because I had touched something that made the air heavier. I stood and walked back to the hallway, then retraced my steps to the front of the house. As I passed the sitting room again, I noticed the light had shifted. The sun had moved. The shadows fell in different places. The room was no longer waiting. It was releasing. I stepped outside. The gardener was gone. The wind had picked up. I stood on the porch for a long time, letting the warm breeze push against my shirt, ripple through my hair. Behind me, the house stood as it always had, proud, quiet, unchanged. But I knew better now. This wasn't a home. It was a room after people, and I had become the one who still remembered what the walls once knew. The envelope was waiting for me when I returned to the motel. It had been slipped under the door, neatly, deliberately. There was no name on the front, no return address, just the pale cream paper, heavier than necessary, folded with care. I stood staring at it for a moment before I bent down to pick it up. The air in the room shifted when I opened it, even though nothing moved. Inside was a single typed page and a business card clipped to the top. The name on the card belonged to someone I didn't recognize, but the title underneath was familiar: estate attorney, financial advisor, legal counsel. The letter was short and precise: a proposal, a transition plan, an invitation to discuss terms for a mutual release of authority over the foundation. It was written in language so clean it almost felt sterile. No emotion, no edge, just bullet points and dates, suggested timelines, a proposed compensation structure, and the veiled implication of discretion. It was, in its tone and timing, the kind of offer that hoped to pass unnoticed beneath the skin. Surgical, quiet, a solution without conflict, dressed as consideration. They didn't want a fight. They wanted me to disappear. I folded the letter and placed it on the nightstand. I didn't touch the card again. The motel room was dim, the curtains drawn. Outside, a neon sign buzzed faintly in the dusk. I sat in the corner chair, the one with the cracked armrest and a cushion that listed to the left. I stared at the opposite wall for a long time, not thinking, just letting the offer settle in my bones. I had received offers before, in my career, in my marriage, in the slow, unraveling years that followed. Offers to make things easier, offers to avoid discomfort, offers that came not out of generosity, but out of someone else's fear that I might hold more power than they anticipated. This was no different. What surprised me, though, was how calm I felt. I thought there would be anger, or maybe shame. But all I felt was clarity, the kind that comes when you finally understand that silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it's preparation. I didn't respond to the letter that night. Instead, I went for a walk. The streets were still warm from the day's sun, the pavement soft under the soles of my shoes. I passed storefronts and bus stops, watched a teenager skate past with headphones on, listened to the low hum of traffic and the distant bark of a dog behind a fence. The city felt ordinary in the best way, anonymous, indifferent. It reminded me of who I had been before all of this, just a man walking through the world without being seen. And it reminded me how much I had allowed myself to vanish. I had let them write me out of the story, not in one moment, but in 1,000 small ways. A conversation I didn't challenge, a signature I gave too quickly, a silence I mistook for peace. Now here I was, holding the pen again. When I returned to the room, I opened the letter once more. I read every word slowly, as if decoding something hidden beneath the font. Then I read it again. I thought about Marcus. I pictured him sitting at a conference table, nodding at someone across the room, assured that this would all be resolved soon. I pictured him checking his watch, confident. I pictured the look on his face at the reading of the will, that flicker of something unprepared. The offer wasn't about money. It never was. It was about comfort, control, narratives. If I accepted it, he could pretend this never happened. The world would go back to its original script. The foundation would return to his hands. The story would be whole again, minus the inconvenient name that now interrupted the third act. But I knew too much now. About the structure, about the influence, about the quiet power that came not from owning, but from deciding. Elaine had left me this for a reason, not just out of sentiment, but because she understood something about permanence, about legacy. She knew what this meant, and maybe, in her way, she trusted me not to sell it back for comfort. I placed the letter back in its envelope and tucked it into my suitcase. Not as rejection, not as acceptance, just as fact. I would not respond right away. I would let time stretch, because they expected urgency. They expected me to grab the offer with both hands, grateful and afraid. But I was neither. I made tea in the motel's rusted kettle, the water cloudy but hot. I sat in the dark and drank it slowly, thinking not about the foundation or the house or Marcus, but about steel, about tension, about what happens when you pull too hard on one end and forget the quiet strength holding the other. In the morning, I walked to a nearby print shop and asked to make a copy of the letter. I folded the copy, placed it in a new envelope, and mailed it to my lawyer back in Spokane. I wrote no note. I just wanted it on file. Then I went to a library. I spent the next 6 hours reading about the foundation, public records, tax filings, project details, names I recognized, names I didn't. I took notes. I traced lines. I followed patterns. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough to know that my involvement mattered. It wasn't just symbolic. It was structural. By the time the sun began to dip again, I closed the last page and looked around the quiet reading room. No one else was watching me. No one knew who I was. And yet, for the first time in years, I felt solid, present. I had no plans to reply to the offer yet. Let them wait. Let the silence answer for now. It had more weight than any reply I could give. I returned to Spokane on a flight that felt shorter than it should have. The sun had just begun to set when the plane touched down, casting the city in that familiar copper light that made even the most ordinary streets look briefly cinematic. The air was cooler here, heavier. It had a different kind of silence, not manufactured or curated like the stillness of that Bel Air house. This was the honest silence of absence, of things that had once lived and moved and laughed, and then simply stopped. The cab dropped me off in front of my house. The porch light had burned out while I was gone. I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, looking up at the windows. They stared back, empty and dark, like unblinking eyes. I opened the gate, walked the path, and unlocked the door. The lock stuck for a second, then gave way with a familiar click that brought something back to life in my memory. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it. The stale air carried the scent of dust and old fabric. My coat still hung on the hook by the door. The last coffee mug I'd used sat in the sink with the rim dried in a crescent of brown. There was a stack of unopened mail on the table, a dead fly on the windowsill, and silence. Not the echoing silence of marble and chandeliers. This was the kind of silence that remembered me. I sat in my armchair without taking off my coat. The cushions had kept my shape, molded to me like an old friend waiting. The heater kicked on with its usual rattling groan, the sound settling into the corners like it always had. I stared at the opposite wall for a long time, not really seeing it, just watching the space between my thoughts and the room. Everything looked smaller now, not physically, but in feeling. The walls had once held my days with comfort. Now they felt like borders, as if the house was shrinking back into itself, unsure of who I had become while I was gone. I got up and walked from room to room. The kitchen looked tired. The linoleum floor curled slightly in one corner. The refrigerator hummed unevenly, a low, anxious sound. I opened the fridge out of habit. Inside, a half-empty bottle of mustard, an apple that had gone soft, a stick of butter sealed in foil. I closed it again. In the hallway, the wallpaper was peeling at the edges, just enough to remind me that time didn't stop when I stepped outside its reach. The bedroom had grown dust in my absence. My pillow still had the faint indentation of my head, though the blanket had gathered itself into a hollow in the center of the mattress. It looked like someone had disappeared instead of stood up. I opened the closet and stared at the rows of shirts, jackets, folded sweaters, all in shades of gray, blue, brown, practical, warm, forgettable. There were no suits, no polished shoes, no clothes for impressing or intimidating, just cloth and thread and buttons, things that served their purpose and nothing more. I ran my hand along the back wall of the closet. The drywall was cool to the touch. My fingers traced the seams, the nail heads. I had patched and painted this wall myself years ago, after a water pipe behind it had burst one winter. I remembered the sound of the leak, the frustration of discovering it too late, the long afternoon spent cutting drywall, drying insulation, swearing quietly into a flashlight. I had done it alone, without asking for help, just like everything else. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. The silence here was patient. It didn't demand anything from me. It had no agenda, but it was honest in a way that other silences were not. It didn't try to hide its age, its sadness. It just was. I thought about the foundation again, the pages I had read in the library, the numbers, the names, the way it all connected in invisible lines. There was so much inside it that no one ever saw. It looked simple from the outside, clean, purposeful, but under the surface, it was layered with intent, with pressure, with compromise. And now I sat here in a room that hadn't changed in a decade, holding authority over something much larger than this house. I wondered if Elaine had foreseen what it would feel like. Not the power, but the dissonance. The way one life could suddenly collide with another, leaving neither intact. I stood and turned on the lamp. The light was yellow and soft, casting shadows that made the room feel warmer, but smaller too. I stared at the bookshelf. Most of the books had spines that hadn't been touched in years. Manuals, memoirs, a few fiction titles I couldn't remember reading. I pulled one down at random. Inside was a receipt from a hardware store, folded into a triangle. The date was from 1997. I had bought screws and sandpaper. Nothing else. The book didn't hold my interest. I returned it to the shelf and opened the window instead. The cold crept in. It was a sharper cold than California had, less forgiving, but more honest. I listened to the wind move through the empty branches of the maple tree in the yard. It made the walls creak, not dangerously, just enough to remind me that they were real, that they had been here long enough to earn their wear. There was no future in these walls, only memory. And yet, memory has weight. It shapes the air. It changes the way we breathe. I thought about leaving, not immediately, but eventually. The house no longer felt like a place where decisions were made. It felt like the shell of a life that had already been spent. It held my history, but not my direction. And that difference mattered now in a way it hadn't before. I didn't pack. I didn't draw plans. I didn't make proclamations. I simply stood by the window and watched the night settle into the yard. The stars overhead were faint, but present. The neighbor's porch light flickered, then died. And in that moment, I knew the walls would be here long after I was gone. But they would no longer define me. I had lived inside them because it was easier, because they were familiar, because they asked nothing of me except presence. But now, presence was not enough. Now there were things that needed tending, quiet things, important things, and they didn't live in this house. They lived in the lines of a foundation I hadn't built but had somehow inherited. And when I finally lay down that night, I closed my eyes not in retreat, but in preparation. The house sighed softly around me, and I no longer needed it to remember who I was. The first time I stepped into the office that controlled the foundation, I expected something larger. I don't know why. Perhaps I had been conditioned by glass towers and marble lobbies, by the slick polish of influence as portrayed in magazines and news segments. I expected leather furniture and bottled water, the silent nods of assistants in expensive shoes. But the building was quiet and unremarkable. No signage on the front, just a plain gray door with a buzzer that let out a tired sound when pressed. A young woman opened it. She didn't smile. She held a clipboard and asked my name, even though she already knew it. Her tone was flat, but not unkind, efficient. She led me through a short hallway lined with framed architectural drawings and into a room that smelled faintly of toner and dust. There were plants near the windows, the kind that survive even when forgotten. The walls were off-white and slightly scuffed near the corners. It wasn't what I imagined. It was real. I sat in the chair offered to me and waited. Across the room was a long table with a pitcher of water, 4 glasses, and a stack of folders. A man in his early 40s entered after a moment. He introduced himself. His name dissolved in my memory as quickly as it had landed. But I remembered his hands. They were clean, smooth, almost soft, the hands of someone who typed more than he wrote. He had the posture of a man who didn't like surprises. He thanked me for coming. I didn't respond. He began by walking me through the structure of the foundation, its branches, partners, ongoing projects, and pending decisions. His words came rehearsed, but I caught the tension behind them. He was speaking to me like someone trying to convince a guest to buy into a timeshare, smiling without teeth, explaining too much, too fast. He mentioned Marcus once, calling him previously involved in active operations. The phrase was carefully chosen, an effort to distance and soften. I let it pass. I asked questions, not many, just enough to make it clear I understood more than they assumed. I referenced numbers I had seen in filings, noted overlapping board memberships, inquired about dormant accounts. I saw something shift in the man's eyes. Not panic, not yet, but caution. He realized I hadn't come to shake hands and pose for pictures. I came to understand, and perhaps to decide. The meeting lasted just over 2 hours. At the end, he offered me a packet of printouts, neatly bound. I took it. He walked me to the door, thanked me again, said the staff was available at any time should I have questions. His voice was practiced, but a little thinner now. I stepped back into the sunlight and stood for a moment on the sidewalk. No plaque, no engraved name, just a building that looked like it could house a dentist's office or an insurance agency. But inside, decisions were made. Quiet ones. The kind that changed neighborhoods. The kind that moved money without sound. Back at the motel, I laid the packet on the bed and read each page. I didn't skim. I read, line by line. There were signatures, schedules, summaries. There were names that had once meant nothing to me, but now carried weight. I saw how it worked, how the foundation had become more than charity. It was a gate, a funnel, a lever, and for years it had moved without resistance, guided by those who knew how to steer from the shadows. Now it would have to pass through me, not because I asked for it, not because I earned it in the traditional sense, but because Elaine had written a sentence, a single sentence that gave me the wheel. I stayed up most of the night with the documents spread around me. I made notes. I circled inconsistencies. I wrote questions in the margins. I mapped the logic of their decisions and found the pattern beneath it. I realized how careful she had been, how many years it must have taken to shape it all into something that could endure. And then I found something else. A project proposal submitted 2 years ago. A bridge repair initiative in a rural county. A modest request, denied due to low-impact visibility. That phrase stayed with me. Low-impact visibility. It meant the project wouldn't make headlines, wouldn't appear on glossy reports, wouldn't offer photos of ribbon cuttings or smiling children, but it would have restored a bridge used by a farming community, one I remembered driving across in 1987. I had once spoken to the engineer who designed the original truss. I highlighted the rejection and set it aside. In the days that followed, I returned to the office 3 more times. I didn't make appointments. I just showed up. Each time, the staff greeted me more cautiously. They stopped offering summaries and started asking questions. They began to realize I was not a figurehead. I was not a ghost. I was not going away. I asked for the full archive. I requested the original charters. I inquired about board meetings, absentee votes, bylaw amendments. I learned the names of those who had been using the foundation as a shield, not illegally, not even immorally, but strategically, efficiently, self-servingly. And I began to write. Not speeches, not statements, directives. I drafted a notice of internal review. I wrote a memo requesting justification for all suspended rural infrastructure projects. I reopened the case of the denied bridge. The man with the soft hands called me. He said he wanted to talk through the pace of these developments. I told him I preferred written communication. He didn't push. Each night, I returned to my room with a deeper understanding. The foundation was not a monolith. It was porous. It could be shaped. It could be bent, quietly, toward something better. Not grand gestures, simple ones. A road paved, a bridge rebuilt, a promise honored. I didn't want my name on a plaque. I wanted the work to outlast my memory. I knew then that the office didn't need a name on the door. It just needed someone inside who remembered what building meant, what weight meant, what silence could become when paired with intent. I wasn't a businessman. I wasn't a politician. I was a man who once believed in structures, and now I was learning how to build again. The first voicemail came 2 days after I sent my first formal directive to the Foundation's board. The voice was Marcus's, controlled, clipped, but with something beneath it. Not anger. Not yet. Frustration, maybe. Confusion. I listened to the message once, then deleted it. I didn't return the call. He left another the next morning. A different tone this time. Slightly warmer. Falsely casual. He referred to miscommunication and public perception and the need to align expectations. He said he was available any time to chat. I turned off the phone and left it on the kitchen table. I had never known Marcus to be a man of many words, but now they kept coming. Every morning, a new message. Some long, some short, some carefully written, others clearly impulsive. They ranged from invitations to demands, from guilt-laced appeals to veiled threats wrapped in legalese. I read none of the transcripts. I didn't press play. I let them stack like unread mail. There were texts, too. At first, 1 or 2 a day, then 5, then more. They flashed across the screen with timestamps and ellipses. I stopped opening them. Eventually, I silenced the notifications entirely. I wasn't trying to punish him. I simply understood that the conversation he wanted to have had already happened, long ago, in the spaces between us that neither of us chose to fill. It had been stretched thin over years of assumptions, sharpened by avoidance, and cooled into permanence. What could we possibly say now that wouldn't be theater? There were things I wished I could say, if only to myself. That I remembered when he was 7 and asked me to show him how suspension cables worked. That I still had the tiny wooden bridge he built out of popsicle sticks and glue in the 4th grade. That I remembered the day he stopped asking me questions and started answering for himself. That I had been silent not because I didn't care, but because I thought space was love. That I thought distance was dignity. That I thought stepping aside was a form of support. Maybe I was wrong, but I didn't think words would fix it now. In the evenings, I walked. I wandered through the neighborhood slowly, letting the cold settle into my bones. It helped me think. It helped me remember who I was before I had titles and responsibilities again. I passed houses with glowing windows, the flicker of televisions, the shadows of people moving through their ordinary lives. I liked the anonymity of it, the lack of pressure. I thought about what I would say if Marcus ever stood in front of me again. I imagined a dozen versions of that meeting, some quiet, some angry, some where he accused me of betrayal, others where he asked me why I hadn't tried harder to be present when he was younger. In none of them did I speak much. In none of them did I explain myself well, because the truth was, I didn't know how to explain the kind of silence that grows between people when both believe they are right to withdraw. I remembered the day he left for college. He didn't hug me. He shook my hand. A 17-year-old boy in a blazer, mimicking adulthood. His palm was damp with nerves. I had wanted to say something then, something about how proud I was, about how difficult it was to let him go. But the moment passed, and I let it. That pattern repeated itself for years. Birthdays, holidays, milestones. I was always a step behind, watching through a fog of self-imposed restraint. I told myself I was giving him freedom, that he needed space to become who he was without my shadow. But now I wondered if that space had simply become a vacuum, filled with whatever resentment he needed to survive. And now, after everything, the silence between us had returned. But it was no longer mutual. He spoke into the void, and I stayed quiet, not as revenge, not even as protection, but because I didn't believe he was ready to listen to the things I had never said. Not really. In the quiet hours, I wrote. I filled legal pads with observations, ideas for the foundation, new guidelines, thoughts on long-term strategy. I sent my notes to the office once a week. They stopped questioning me. They began implementing. I saw changes, subtle, but real. Projects reactivated. Budgets realigned. Applications from communities that had once been ignored now received replies. The language on the website changed. Less corporate, more human. And still, Marcus's messages came. They began to take a different tone, edgy, uncertain, layered with desperation he hadn't yet learned to hide. He began using phrases like damage control and reputational risk. He referenced lawyers. He warned of consequences. I let it all pass through me, because the most powerful conversation we never had was already shaping the world around us. I didn't need to say no. I had already lived it. The conversation that never happened had been replaced by action, by choice, by the quiet refusal to be pulled back into the cycle of explanation and denial. There is a certain clarity that comes when you stop trying to be understood by someone who was never listening, not out of cruelty, but out of distance, out of time. One morning, I found a letter in my mailbox, handwritten, no return address, just my name. I recognized the handwriting immediately. I opened it slowly, carefully, as if it might vanish. It was short, barely a paragraph. He didn't apologize. He didn't accuse. He just said he didn't understand what I was trying to do, but that he hoped, for everyone's sake, I was doing it for the right reasons. I folded the letter and placed it in the back of my drawer, between a utility bill and an old photograph of the bridge I built outside Helena. I didn't respond. Because there are some bridges you don't cross twice, some you let stand in silence, not as monuments, but as reminders of the conversations that never needed words. The first time I saw the bridge again, it was from the passenger side window of a rented sedan, crawling down a winding county road, lined with thinning trees and quiet barns. It wasn't a grand bridge, no steel arches or soaring suspension towers, just a two-lane crossing over a narrow river that split the fields in half, like a quiet breath. The kind of bridge most people didn't notice. But I had built it once. I was 43 when the county approved the design. It had taken months to secure funding, longer still to gather the right team. We poured the concrete in the heat of summer, the kind that made your shirt stick to your back before sunrise. I'd spent hours checking the rebars, brushing off the dust, measuring the grade of the slope to ensure runoff wouldn't pool during storms. It wasn't the biggest project I'd worked on, but it was mine. Quiet, sturdy, and meant to last longer than the names on the plans. The bridge had held. Through 2 floods, through 3 state budget freezes, through truckloads of grain and years of quiet disrepair. And then, some years back, it had been deemed non-essential by the same kind of administrative minds who never walked across it, never watched the frost climb its sides in the early morning, never felt its low vibration as tractors rolled across it after harvest. They had filed it under low-impact visibility, the phrase that had followed me home like a shadow. It had stayed in my mind since I read those words. That was why I pushed to reopen the project, not for symbolism, not for sentiment, but because I believed in the function of forgotten things, in their purpose, their proof. Now, driving down the road that curved like a question toward it, I saw the construction tape fluttering in the breeze. Temporary barriers marked the edges of the site. A yellow excavator sat idle in the grass, and 2 men in hard hats stood by a truck, sipping coffee from plastic cups. I pulled over near the edge and stepped out. The air smelled like late autumn, wet leaves, damp soil, and the faint sting of diesel. I walked to the edge of the gravel shoulder and looked out across the frame. The concrete was stripped down in parts, some of the rebar exposed and rusting. But the bones were still good. I knew that without touching. I had built them to be that way. One of the workers looked up, nodded. I nodded back. He didn't ask who I was, and I didn't volunteer. It was better that way. I stood there for a while, watching, listening. The wind passed low across the fields, making the brittle grasses whisper. A crow lifted from the far bank and disappeared into the trees. I remembered standing in this exact place decades ago, watching the river flow underneath the first beam we'd laid, watching it accept the shadow of something human, without protest. It was strange to see it halfway deconstructed, exposed, vulnerable. But it didn't feel broken. It felt like transition, like breathing out. The project had been approved quietly, almost reluctantly, after I redirected a portion of unused administrative funds. I didn't have to fight for it. I just shifted a few lines. No press release, no announcement, just an internal memo and a new contractor agreement. No one in the boardroom had even asked why. That was the power I had now. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just the ability to say yes to the right thing when everyone else had forgotten how to see it. After a while, I walked down the embankment to the side of the river. The soil was soft underfoot, the kind that gave a little but held its shape. I crouched near the edge, ran my hand across a piece of old support that had been cut clean. The texture was familiar, pitted from weather, lined from wear, but intact. It was strange to feel something you once touched in its infancy, now so aged, so weathered. I thought about how many people had crossed it without knowing its name, how many tires, how many footsteps, how many quiet moments in the middle of the night when headlights cut across the guardrails like brief promises of presence. No one would ever know I was there. No one would care. The plaque, if there had ever been one, was long gone, worn or stolen or replaced. But I knew, and that was enough. That night, back in my room, I sketched the bridge from memory, not as it was, but as I first imagined it, clean, complete, untouched. My hands remembered the angle of the supports, the spacing between the columns, the flow of the load-bearing arc. I drew slowly, deliberately, letting the pencil follow lines my fingers hadn't traced in years. When I finished, I pinned the drawing above the small desk where I had started to keep notes for the foundation. It hung crookedly, the tape barely holding, but it belonged there. Because the bridge mattered, not for what it was, but for what it meant, a structure built without glory, a structure that stood, that bore the weight of others without applause, that held, even when no one was watching. Like some of us do. The day I signed the final document, the sky was the color of dull metal, not stormy, not bright, just gray enough to make everything seem stiller than it was. I woke early, as I often did, before the sun had fully risen, before the birds made their presence known. The motel room felt smaller that morning, as if it had pulled in closer around me overnight, nudging me toward an exit I hadn't quite prepared for. The folder had been sitting on the desk for 3 days. I hadn't opened it since the courier slid it across the table and said, without eye contact, that there was no rush. But everyone knows that's never true. I had let it rest there, unopened but undeniable, a quiet thing that filled the space like smoke. I boiled water for tea, sat in the chair by the window, stared out at the parking lot. A delivery truck idled near the edge of the lot, its driver smoking, hunched against the cold. The world didn't care what I was about to do. That was comforting. I didn't need an audience. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were 5 pages, each one carefully spaced, neatly formatted, printed on paper thicker than it needed to be. It wasn't a legal contract exactly, not anymore. It was an affirmation, a finalization, a direction set, not asked. It named me as chair of the Oversight Committee for the Gardner Future Bridges Foundation. It defined the terms of authority. It confirmed the reallocation of decision-making rights. It detailed the systems now permanently under my control. There were no flowery introductions, No dedications. No language of gratitude. Just clauses and bullet points. The kind of document where the meaning lives in the quiet between sentences. I held the pen in my hand for a while before I touched it to the page. I had signed my name 1,000 times before. On checks, on engineering reports, on building permits and tax forms and apology letters. It had never meant anything more than obligation or protocol. But this felt different. This felt like permanence. I pressed the pen down and began to write. Each stroke slow, each letter deliberate. My name unfolded in its usual form, a shape I had made since childhood, but it landed heavier on the page than it ever had before, like something final had rooted itself under the ink. I didn't feel triumphant or emotional. I didn't feel vindicated. The signature didn't come with the release of tension or the surge of victory. What I felt was quiet. Quiet in my chest. Quiet in my hands. Quiet in the room. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. I returned the pen to the table and stared at the paper for a long moment. Not to admire it. Not to second-guess it. Just to witness it. I folded the documents and slid them back into the envelope. Sealed it. Addressed it, then placed it beside the door where I wouldn't forget it on my way out. I packed slowly. A few shirts, my notes, the sketch of the bridge carefully rolled and tucked inside a cardboard tube, the letter Marcus had written, still unread a second time, but kept nonetheless. I didn't know why. Maybe because it represented the last honest thing he might ever say to me. Or maybe because it represented something unfinished, and I no longer needed to finish everything. I walked to the post office that afternoon, carrying the envelope under my coat, the chill of winter brushing my face. The woman behind the counter recognized me now. She nodded and took the package without a word. I watched her weigh it, label it, and set it into a bin. The moment it left my hand, it was no longer mine. Outside, the sky remained gray. I didn't go back to the motel. I kept walking. Through the old part of town, where buildings still carried ghost signs painted on brick. Through the neighborhood where trees leaned over cracked sidewalks and wind chimes sang without melody. I let my feet move without direction. I passed the library, the diner, the small hardware store with a dusty window display of tools that hadn't been restocked in years. And finally, I stood at the edge of the park. There was an old wooden bench there, under a thinning elm. I sat. The wood creaked, but held. I looked out across the open field. Brown grass, a few birds pecking at frozen ground, children's swings hanging still in the windless air. This was where I had once brought Marcus when he was very young. He used to run ahead of me, arms out like wings, pretending he was an airplane. I remembered the sound of his laugh, not the tone of it. Time had stolen that. But the shape of it, the rhythm, the way it broke across open space like something unafraid. Now there was only the whisper of leaves and the slow breath of winter pressing down. That night, back in my room, I opened the window before bed. The air was cold and sharp. It cut through the warmth inside like a scalpel, but I let it stay. I lay on the bed, under the worn blanket, and stared at the ceiling. There were no words left to say, no calls to return, no conversations waiting in some imagined future, only the sound of wind against glass and the weight of a signature written without fanfare. I closed my eyes and let the silence do what it was always meant to do, hold the shape of everything that had come before without demanding more from it. It was done, and I was still here.